The Faith Inclusion Network welcomes you to this virtual presentation held April 24th, 2020, presenting David Eckert from Access Services in Pennsylvania.
So getting started officially, my name is Karen Jackson. I'm the Executive Director of Faith Inclusion Network. I am currently in my newly set up home office in Norfolk, Virginia, and home with two of my three children, trying to figure out how to make this all work. But Michelle Munger and I, Michelle's our Associate Director of FIN, we're talking about what FIN could possibly offer the community right now. And I don't know about you, but I think one of the biggest things that I've seen concerns is really on mental health and how this is affecting not only us personally, but people around us. And I just thought that the best way to start or to have a virtual presentation would be to invite someone who knew more than I do about it, which luckily for us, we know Dave Eckert. So I'm really, really pleased. Thank you, Dave, for being a part of this. And
yeah,
we're excited about listening to you. And if you don't already know Dave, he is from Pennsylvania. He is an associate pastor and also he manages a network of faith communities that have mental health ministries. And if you are at our last FIN conference, Faith Inclusion Network conference last March, you may have met him or even heard him speak because he joined us for the first time then. So I'm going to let him tell you a little bit more about himself in Access Services where he works and just, take away. Oh, and then one more thing is that we definitely want your questions. We're going to actually do some polling and Dave will explain that. And then so after his presentation, he will open it up to questions. And some of us as we got in early, we're able to say our names and where we're from. But when we do the questions later on, I'll remind you about this. We're going to ask you just to say your name and where you're from, and then ask your question. But anyway, okay, so let's let Dave take it away.
thanks, Karen. And I do want to thank FIN for having me today. And I want to actually send also a thanks to a group that's also helping to sponsor this called MHTTC, the Mental Health Technology Transfer Center. They're funded by SAMHSA, which is yet another long set of words, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. They're really passionate about getting training out to not just mental health professionals, but to people in the broader community, in particular to a lot of people in faith communities, because they recognize that these best practices around mental wellness need to be in the hands of people beyond just professionals if it's really going to make an impact in the wider, region, society, world, really. So a little bit about me. Karen mentioned a piece of it, but just how I came to you today is I had been for many years in the mental health field, directing a mobile psychiatric rehabilitation program, about 18 years. And over that same amount of time, I've been a pastor. And it struck me as I was living in each of these different worlds that those two worlds often didn't interrelate very much. And oftentimes faith communities struggle to know, how do we navigate mental health for people in our congregations? But just as much, the mental health services I was interacting with struggled to know, how do I pay attention to the spiritual dimension of people? So we started this new initiative called Intersect in the last few years. And Intersect's mission is to basically support people at the intersection of faith and mental health through consultation and training and fostering collaboration between mental health services and faith communities. So we can say more about that later on, but that's what brings me to today's conversation. And I'm really pleased that you've taken time to be part of it, because I think this is a crucial time for a conversation like this. I want to say two reasons why I think that's the case. First, we're not just living in a public health crisis. We're, as many people are realizing, we're living in the midst of a mental health crisis as well. It was just 2 weeks ago today that even the White House convened a conference call of a number of different mental health professionals to discuss the fact that people's mental health is being impacted by this pandemic. And we need to think through, what are we going to do about that? But more than this just being a mental health crisis that we're living in, where we have to think about just our own mental wellness, it's also actually an open door. We've been saying that though we are living in a time of closed doors, we're all kind of inside, huddling, concerned with what's outside, it's also a time of open doors, because not just people being served in the mental health system, people all along the continuum of mental wellness, whether they're in the system or just people who you would never think might be struggling right now, are becoming much more vulnerable and are becoming much more open about the struggles they're going through. And it provides us with an open door to walk with them well, listen well, and even help them think through what are some strategies for being able to maintain their mental wellness. So what I want to do today, in light of this important conversation, is I want to offer 5 strategies, 5 things you can do for your mental wellness. And in each of those different ways, you can also have an open door to help another person. Now, what we're going to do is, for each of these different 5 things you can do, we're actually going to post a poll question. And we invite you to respond to it, and maybe in the Q&A time afterwards, we'll have a chance to be able to delve a little bit deeper into what these poll questions showed us, and see what the results say. But the first of the 5 things you can do for your mental wellness and that of other people is to focus on calling more than control. Again, focus on calling more than control. We have a mobile crisis team at our organization, and this mobile crisis team, it's a 24/7 hotline where they go out and support people, not just through the phone, but actually go out as teams to see people where they are in crisis. And one of the themes in their work is that they notice when people are in crisis, they tend to feel out of control. They just feel like things are happening to them that they can't do anything about. Sense of just losing control. And it brings up the response that they often need to do in this program is to empower people, to give them choice, to give them some semblance of control in their life. And what we're seeing is that in this time of pandemic, people are also experiencing a lack of control, and it's bringing about a more destabilizing place around their mental wellness. I've been getting texts, even from people I know, with just death tolls. They're just thinking constantly about the rising number of deaths throughout the world related to the pandemic, and they just feel powerless to do anything about it. And this whole intersection of a pandemic and the loss of control and mental wellness, I was reading about it just recently from an article by a clinical psychologist named Mary Alvord. And this is what she says. She says, some of the anxiety people are feeling comes from feeling out of control, like there's nothing we can do about all these things that are important to our daily lives, or even plan for them. Which brings up the question, what do we do about this sense that we just don't have the control in our world that we thought we had maybe prior to the pandemic? And this is where I want to encourage us to focus on calling more than control. So that sounds confusing. I want to give you an example of what I mean. I want to give an example from Scripture. I'll be making connections throughout this talk between things we've learned in the mental health field and things that we're also learning from faith traditions. In the Christian New Testament, we had just passed through Holy Week, where we celebrated Good Friday, Jesus' death, and celebrate Easter Sunday, his resurrection. And it's interesting, in the New Testament, after Jesus dies, it says that his disciples were together with the doors locked for fear. They were just huddled thinking, are we going to be killed like Jesus was killed? But only a few chapters later, that's John 20, a few chapters later in Acts chapter 4, it says that these same people, they were all filled with the Holy Spirit and spoke the word of God boldly, which raises the question, what changed from people who were hunkered like us in our homes with fear of something outside? What changed between that state and the state of feeling confident enough to go out and just speak boldly? Well, what didn't change was the level of risk they were under. They just had as much risk, and some of them did, in fact, lose their lives. What changed is Jesus appeared to them and he gave them a calling. He gave them what's called the Great Commission. He gave them a sense that they had something that they could do, rather than just feeling a sense of vulnerability that they had lost control. This same theme of calling comes up I mentioned SAMHSA earlier, they have a document called the 10 Domains of Wellness. And in this document, one of these domains that are listed is a sense of meaning and purpose. It's similar to calling in this sense, the sense that there's something for me to do here. And even SAMHSA, a secular institution of government, says that often a person's sense of meaning and purpose is derived from their spirituality, their spiritual beliefs or practices. So therefore, if we focus on calling more than control, it can help us during these times of feeling like there's just nothing we can do about what we're facing. But in addition to our own focus, it's also an open door. As I said, there would be open doors for each of these strategies. And this open door might be to just gather people for Zoom meetings like this one to discuss, maybe it's coworkers, maybe it's friends, to discuss what does it look like to maintain mental wellness. In my own workplace, I bring up this idea because someone who I don't even know whether they're a person of faith came to me and said, look, my staff are really experiencing a lot of spiritual and emotional discouragement right now. What can we do for them? And we had this idea that we would just start a weekly Zoom call to talk about wellness in the workplace. And as we've been having these calls, it's really been helpful to the people participating and help them see things they can do rather than just focusing on all that they can't do. So the first of these 5 wellness strategies then is to focus on calling more than control. The second strategy is this, and remember, take a look at the polls as they're coming through. The second strategy is do the thing you least want and most need. Do the thing you least want and most need. Why do I say this? Well, I can think of at least 3 people, maybe more, who've said to me almost the same exact sentence. And this is the sentence. When I'm depressed, they say, the last thing I want to do is to be with people. But when I do it, I realize it's the thing I needed most. Why are so many people saying that? That the last thing they want to do when they're in a tough place is to be with people. When they do it, they realize it's the thing they needed most. Well, I think there's a couple reasons for this. First, it's known that depression, not just clinical depression, but a variety of forms of just feeling depressed often leads to isolation. It leads to us going inward. But here's the thing. As Marie Hoffman, a clinical psychologist, said, we are born to relate. So even when the last thing we want to do is to leave our place of isolation, when we actually experience human relationship, because of how we're made, it makes us realize, this is very much what I need. This same idea comes out in the Psychiatric Rehabilitation Association's set of core principles and values. One of their principles and values is community integration. And what the association says about it is that the full integration of people into their communities helps with mental health recovery, helps with wellness. And this same idea, is already seen for those of us of faith. It's seen in the Christian scriptures. In Hebrews 10:25, the believers are told not to give up meeting together, even though they're in the habit of doing that. Not to give up meeting. Why? Because when you do it, you're able to encourage one another. So it's so vital. The scriptures show us this. The mental health field is saying this. People in my own life are telling me this. It's so crucial that when the last thing we want to do is to be with people, that we do it, because when we do it, we'll realize it's the thing we needed most for our mental wellness. Now, concrete community is hard to come by at the best of times, but it's really hard to come by in the midst of a pandemic where you're being asked to stay inside. So what do we do about that fact? Do we just say, well, I guess this is a time for isolation? Well, I think this is another place where, in addition to our own wellness and participating in events like these and workplace calls and just Zoom calls maybe with friends after hours, it's also worthwhile to think about inviting people in your network to participate in potentially online worship watch parties that are going on in many places. In my own faith community, we've had more people trying out our community since the pandemic started than ever before. Why is that? Well, at least part of the reason is we do a Facebook Live worship gathering, and people can safely dip their toes in the waters of community and say, what do I think about these people? And we've seen this be able to be a catalyst for people finding community. Is it the best possible community right now where we're still in our homes? No. But it's letting people who are isolated, who are feeling more and more depressed, to be able to develop some new relationships. So it can both be a great tip for your own wellness, but also for other people to do the thing you least want and actually most need. The third, I said there'd be 5. The third wellness strategy, and there will be another poll question coming up, is to develop healthy rhythms for a new reality. To develop healthy rhythms for a new reality. This new reality we're living in, I admit to you, I thought that this was going to be easier. I thought that, and I think a lot of people did, first few days working from home, oh, this is going to be a little bit less stressful. But what I'm hearing constantly from people across various professions is it feels like there's more work now that people are facing, not less. This new reality is bringing increasing stress to us. And while stress isn't necessarily a mental health diagnosis, it's well known that stress can be, at least, a trigger around our mental wellness. It can destabilize us. It can put us into a worse place with our mental health. And so I was thinking about what to do about this increasing stress that so many of us are facing. I thought of the book of Daniel in the Hebrew Bible. Daniel was someone who, very much like us, was experiencing a stressful new reality. If you go to the book of Daniel, what happens is, after Babylon comes and destroys Jerusalem, they cart off a number of different people back to Babylon, and Daniel is one of them. And what happens is they realize, Daniel's a pretty smart guy. The text says that he's well-informed, quick to understand, well-qualified. And they say, we need to put him in governmental service. So think of Daniel's new reality. He's in a totally foreign place that he was not used to living in, some ways like us. And he's got an increased workload as he's being put into this 3-year prep plan for working in government. You could excuse Daniel if he didn't think about his mental wellness. If all he thought about was, I just need to work hard and get the job done. I don't have time. But that's precisely not what Daniel did. Sure, he worked hard. But in chapter 1, it says that he began to think about how he was eating. It says that he wanted to be faithful to his God in his own dietary laws. He wanted to be healthy. So he began saying, I want to eat different than my colleagues. And later in the text, we see that he was healthier and better nourished than any of the other people who ate royal food. And not only his physical health was he paying attention to, he was putting in these new rhythms for his spiritual health. It says that, again, in chapter 6, amidst all the work he had in government, 3 times a day he got down on his knees and he prayed. And it brings up the question for us, what new rhythms do we need to put in place, or what old rhythms do we need to just maintain in this new reality we find ourselves in? The mental health field is talking more and more in recent years about the concept of integrated health. You may have heard this. Integrated health is basically getting at the notion that each dimension of our health is connected to other dimensions. It's affected by and affects these other dimensions. So spiritual health, social health, emotional health, physical health, each of these domains affects one another. So I would encourage you to be thinking about, what new rhythms do you need to put into place maybe for your physical health, whether that be sleep or exercise and nutrition? What new rhythms do you need to put in place for your social health in terms of connecting with other people? What new rhythms do you need to put in place for your spiritual health, just to be with God in prayer or with scripture and other ways that your community of faith is worshiping? All these have always been important, but they're crucially important in the new reality we find ourselves in. And in addition to it helping us, it can also present us with, again, another open door to walk with people well. Because people in the world, they recognize this notion of integrated health, of being holistic. And we have an open door just to talk to people about the fact of, how are you, what rhythms are you putting in place? For some of the people I asked that question to, they say they don't have new rhythms. They just feel busier. They feel like they're working more than ever. They're working in evenings. To be honest, sometimes my wife has said to me, I feel like you're working more now than you used to before the pandemic. In light of that, new rhythms of self-care need to be put in place for our new reality. So in conclusion, conclusion of this third point, we need to develop healthy rhythms for a new reality. Two more. The fourth of our wellness strategies is to hold together grief and gratitude. I'll say it again, hold together grief and gratitude. And again, you can answer the corresponding poll question that we have. The world's foremost expert on the study of gratitude, his name is Robert Emmons from the University of California, Davies. Emmons wrote a book called Gratitude Works, and it's actually a 21-day program for creating what he calls emotional prosperity. And what you're seeing in the mental health field right now is more and more acknowledgement that gratitude, giving thanks, is a really valuable thing to do, not just because it's morally right, but because it actually helps us with our mental health. Though, not surprisingly, the faith community has understood this for much longer than some of these psychological researchers have. Paul, in the book of Philippians in the New Testament, says these words that some of you may have heard. Don't be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, make your requests known to God. It's interesting that Paul is suggesting that when we're most anxious and we're crying out to God in prayer, in addition to typical petition, God, take away the anxiety, he's encouraging us to also give thanks. Is that a heartless and sensitive thing to encourage? No, I think what Paul understands is actually what something many researchers now understand, that it's hard to be anxious and grateful at the same time. Gratitude is a practice. Gratitude is something that we become more used to in our life, is actually something that can help us deal with the anxiety that we feel, can help us improve our mental wellness. I see this all over the place these days, this idea of the both and of grief and gratitude. I was reading a book that I would recommend called Walking with God in Pain and Suffering by an author named Tim Keller. And Keller, in the final section of his book, lays out a number of different practices that you can be employing to help with your own, help you grapple and help you work through suffering. And it's interesting that he has a chapter on weeping and a chapter on thanking. He holds weeping and thanking together, not as you do one thing or you do the other, but as both important to be able to walk through suffering. If you pray the Psalms, for example, you see both of these. If you pray the Psalms, you're going to come to Psalm 13, where it says, how long, Lord, will you forget me forever? But if you keep reading, you're going to pray Psalm 136 that says, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever. There is a both and of holding together grief and gratitude. And it's worth asking, which of these might you be struggling to hold on to during this time? Because both are necessary. Now, you might think, well, okay, I've got the grief thing down. I don't know what to give thanks for. All I can see is things to lament about, things to be so broken about. And I understand that. And that's why it might help to start with thinking not just about giving thanks for the big things of life, but also for the smaller things as well. G.K. Chesterton, who was an author back in the early 20th century, talks about just the way he would give thanks. He calls it saying grace for all the little things in his life. This is what Chesterton writes. He says, you say grace before meals? All right, but I say grace before the concert and the opera, and grace before the play and pantomime, and grace before I open a book, and grace before sketching, painting, swimming, fencing, dancing, walking, playing, dancing, and grace before I dip the pen into the ink. What is he saying? He's saying, I look for moments big and small for gratitude. And that's not just valuable, again, because God deserves our gratitude. It's helpful because it puts us into a better place with our mental wellness. A practice that it's really practical that I learned from a friend that I've tried to implement is just having a gratitude journal. Each day, can you just give thanks for 5 things? Again, it could be as little as a cup of coffee or as big as, your faith community or as big as God himself. But in addition to this practice of gratitude, this is just for yourselves, this is just another open door, I think, because if it's true that gratitude really can help anybody with their own mental wellness, then it's worth sharing with people who you know, coworkers, friends, about the wellness benefits of gratitude and asking them, what does gratitude look like for you? And maybe giving them some ideas like the gratitude journal, giving them some ideas of things you find yourself able to give thanks for on any given day. So the fourth of our wellness strategies is to hold together grief and gratitude. The final one, the fifth one, then we'll get to discussing some of these things. Along with the corresponding poll question that is coming, the fifth wellness strategy is to go beyond coping to hoping. Go beyond coping to hoping. A crisis has been defined by some as that moment when your current coping skills are no longer working. Everything that helped before you to cope with what you're facing isn't working anymore. I heard a good example of this when not too long ago I was listening to a podcast in the midst of the pandemic. I just wanted to listen to a sports podcast to take my mind off of some of these things that we were facing. And I'm an Eagles fan. I'm from Philadelphia. I don't know if there are any Boston people here, but I wanted to listen to this one sports analyst, Bill Simmons, who was a Boston fan, and I wanted to hear him bemoan the fact that Tom Brady had left. But I didn't hear that. What I heard that day was Simmons say these words. He said, "This continues to be the scariest month that we've had since I've been alive." This sports analyst, who had typically been able to have these ways of coping with sports and with entertainment, with all these things taken away, it was just hitting him how scared he was as he heard about different deaths. And I think there's a lot of people right now who experience what mental health professionals called death anxiety or death terror. But despite the fact that death has become more real as we hear the numbers and as we think about our own vulnerability, surprisingly, death isn't something that's been written about all that often in the mental health literature. Well, a few years back, there was a psychiatrist who wanted to do something about that. His name was Irvin Yalom. And Yalom wrote a book called Staring at the Sun, Overcoming the Terror of Death. Yalom is an atheist psychiatrist, so he's writing from that place. And what Yalom wanted to do is say, here are some things you can do to manage your fear of death. I want to state two of them that he offers, but then offer some other perspectives that I think are a helpful antidote to some of what's shared in Yalom's book. One idea Yalom gives as an atheist is the idea of symmetry. He says, well, life is symmetrical. You didn't exist before you were born. You're not going to exist after you die. So there's just a nothingness to death that you don't need to worry about because you weren't too stressed out about the fact that you didn't exist before you were born. You're not going to be all that stressed or worried about not existing after you die. That's the idea of symmetry. Or Yalom also talks about the idea of rippling. Rippling means, well, yes, you may die and cease to exist, but things you've said, things you've believed, an impact you made can ripple throughout the universe in other people's lives. And I don't discount that to be true, that the things we do and the things we say can have an effect on people that we leave behind. But it struck me that as I was reading this book alongside a friend of mine who happens to be an atheist, we both came to the same conclusion, that Yalom's ideas, while helping people learn what are ways of maybe being able to cope, they didn't really offer ways of being able to hope in the face of death. They didn't offer a way through. They just helped a way to maybe manage some of those fears, which can be a struggle for our wellness because as much mental health literature has said, hope is actually a wellness value, just as much as things we've said earlier, things like gratitude or things like community. Hope is also a wellness value. But how do we experience mental wellness when we're confronted with death, but we don't have hope? We have ways of maybe coping, but we don't have any sort of hope beyond death. Well, I think this is one of those ways where our faith can really bolster our own mental wellness. And I would encourage you to think about, how does your faith help you to not just cope with what you're facing, but actually help you to hope for life beyond the death that you're facing? And I think this is an open door for conversation with other people, not in some sort of salesman way. I'm not calling for people to have to go out and you're trying to force people to believe what you believe. What I'm saying is that in the context of a rising death toll and the importance of hope when it comes to wellness, it's worth asking people, where do you find hope amidst this? And you may find yourself, as you have that conversation, in a place that I found myself with someone recently who was talking about their fear of death. The question of, where do you find hope? And in the New Testament, it talks about in 1 Peter 3, the need to always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks, to give a reason for the hope that you have. But you have to do it, as Peter says, with gentleness and respect. This isn't a way to force people into your worldview, but it is a way to offer hope and to share where that hope is derived from for you. And for me, as a Christian, I often go back to a statement made in the book of 1 Thessalonians. Paul there says, we don't grieve like the rest of mankind who have no hope. He doesn't say we don't grieve. We have to grieve. As I said, we have to hold together grief and gratitude. But I believe mental wellness comes when we have a hope-infused grief. And where does Paul say that hope comes from? Well, for him, he says, I believe that Jesus died and rose again. And so I believe that God will bring with Jesus those who have fallen asleep with him. He has hope, and that hope, despite imprisonments he had, despite all sorts of times where he was just not in a good place with his mental health, that hope helped him through. It was not just a way of coping with the fear of death. He had a way of hoping as well. And what I hope for you is that in these 5 different strategies we've laid out, that at least one of them might be able to be something you could implement as we move forward, and could be a strategy that can help with your own mental wellness, but also the mental wellness of others. A little bit later, we're going to be offering you a chance to give us some feedback through evaluation forms on today's training. But before we even get there, I want to hand it back to Karen, and we're going to begin looking at some of your responses to the poll questions, and maybe also having a little bit of Q&A. So, Karen.
Well, first of all, thank you so much, Dave. That was awesome. Yes, Shelly's given us the really, really great presentation.
Our Q&A time was not recorded to protect privacy concerns. We hope you will join us next time. We also thank the Central East Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, which is part of a national network funded by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration. Your attendance and support through evaluations help demonstrate the need for training such as this. Thank you. For more information about the Faith Inclusion Network, visit us online at www.faithinclusionnetwork.org.